You're sitting in the cab of an old truck, rain drumming on the roof, a mattress in the back, a little stove by your knee, everything you own inside 4 steel walls. And you're warm and fed, and you didn't pay a soul for the privilege. That picture is exactly what pulled me into this. Here's what I found, and I'll say it plain. People were living better out of a vehicle 100 years ago than most folks manage in a rented room today. They stayed cool without electricity. They cooked a full hot meal while the engine did nothing, and it cost them almost nothing. This wasn't fringe. This was a movement of millions, and then it was quietly made to disappear. The trail ends at a brittle pamphlet and a club founded in a Tampa park in 1919, and I promise you the method waiting there is something you can try in your own driveway this weekend. It works whether you own a van, a pickup, or just a kitchen with a power bill you're tired of paying. Stay with me, because the deeper I dug, the angrier I got. I should tell you where this started for me. I was at an estate sale in a little farm town, going through a box of water-stained paper nobody wanted, and I pulled out a folded auto-camping guide from the 1920s with a handwritten note in the margin. It said, "Cook it before you leave. Eat it at noon." I had no idea what that meant. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And that single line sent me down a rabbit hole that took me the better part of a year to climb back out of. So let me start where the mystery started. Because before I could understand why anyone would scribble a note like that, I had to understand who these people were. I always thought living out of a vehicle was a modern thing, something that started with hippies in the 1960s, or something people do now because rent got out of hand. I was wrong by about 50 years. The truth is, the golden age of living on wheels happened between about 1910 and 1930, and the numbers are staggering. When the automobile got cheap enough for ordinary families, something nobody planned for happened. People realized the car wasn't just for getting somewhere. It was somewhere. They called it auto-camping, and it swept the country. By the early 1920s, transportation researchers of the day estimated that somewhere between 5 and 15 million Americans were auto-camping every single year. Think about that. In a country far smaller than today's, millions of people packed a car, drove off, and lived out of it for weeks or months at a time. Doctors did it, bankers did it, working families did it. It cut across every class because the appeal was simple. You were free and you were cheap. In 1919, a group of these travelers gathered in DeSoto Park in Tampa, Florida, and formed a club. They called themselves the Tin Can Tourists. The name came from the tin cans of food they heated on manifolds and the tin Lizzie Fords many of them drove. To join, you soldered a tin can to your radiator cap. They had a secret handshake. They had a theme song. At their peak, they numbered in the tens of thousands, and they had worked out, through pure trial and error, how to live comfortably out of a vehicle without spending money on the things we now consider mandatory. They rigged folding beds that turned a back seat into a full bed in under a minute. They built cabinets into running boards. They cooked on the exhaust manifold while they drove, so the meal was hot the second they parked. They knew which side of a tree to camp on for morning shade and which for afternoon shade. They knew how to hang a canvas to catch a breeze and drop the temperature inside by 10 or 15 degrees. This was a complete, working body of knowledge, refined by millions of people, and almost none of it survives in any modern guide. But here's the part that stopped me cold. All of this practical genius, this enormous popular movement, mostly vanished from public memory within a couple of decades. Not because it stopped working, it worked beautifully. Something made it go away. And when I started pulling that thread, I found out somebody wanted it gone. So let me tell you who and how, because this is where the story turns. In those early years, auto campers could pull off the road and sleep almost anywhere. Towns actually loved them at first. A family that camps outside your town spends money in your town. So municipalities built free public campgrounds to attract them, thousands of them across the country, with water and fire pits and sometimes electric lights, all free. For about 10 years, free was the rule of the land. Then the free campgrounds started closing, and they didn't close by accident. Therefore I went looking for who benefited, and the answer showed up in the trade journals of the late 1920s. A new industry had appeared, and it was furious about all this free living. The auto camp operators and then the early motor courts, the motels, saw millions of travelers sleeping for nothing and understood every one of those nights was a room they could have rented. The hotel associations felt the same way. These were organized businesses with money and a message, and their message was that free campers were a problem, not paying customers. A problem. So the framing changed. The same families who had been welcomed were suddenly recast as undesirables, as vagrants, as a threat to property values. City after city passed ordinances against sleeping in a vehicle, against camping within town limits, against parking overnight on a public street. The free camps were bulldozed or turned into pay sites. And the pay sites grew into the motel industry we know today. The historian Warren Belasco laid a lot of this out in his research on early auto travel, tracing how the open road got fenced off one ordinance at a time. The freedom didn't fade. It was legislated away, because somebody had figured out how to charge for what people used to do for nothing. That's the pattern I keep running into in everything I investigate. A free method that works, a business that can't stand it, and a quiet campaign to make the free method look shameful, or illegal, or impossible, until a whole generation forgets it was ever normal. But knowing the knowledge was buried on purpose only made me want it more. If millions of people once lived cool, warm, and well-fed out of a vehicle for pennies, I wanted the actual methods, not the nostalgia, the how. So I kept digging into the old guides, and what I found next is something you can use tonight, even if you never sleep in a vehicle a day in your life. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking right about now. This is fine for someone with a van and a project budget and a weekend to spare, but it's got nothing to do with me and my house. I thought the same thing. Then I realized the whole reason these vehicle dwellers were geniuses is that they had no room, no power, and no money to waste, which is exactly the situation a lot of us are trying to manage inside four walls, with a bill attached to every comfort. Everything they figured out under those limits works even better in a fixed home. Let me prove it. Start with heat, because heat is where the old-timers really shine. The tin can tourists and the auto campers understood something we've mostly forgotten. You do not heat a space. You trap heat where the body is. Modern instinct is to warm all the air in a room, which is the single most expensive way to stay warm ever invented, because air holds almost no heat and leaks out every crack. The old way was the opposite. They surrounded the sleeping space with anything that would slow heat loss and put the warmth right against the person. They stuffed newspaper between blankets. That sounds like a joke until you understand why it works. Trapped air is the insulator, and crumpled newspaper is mostly trapped air held in place, which is exactly what an expensive down comforter does with feathers. Wartime and Depression-era testing by home economists at Agricultural Extension Services confirmed that layered paper between two thin blankets could match a heavy quilt for warmth at zero cost. You already have old newspaper, or you can get it free. Slide a few sheets between your top sheet and your blanket on a cold night, and you'll feel the difference before you fall asleep. It rustles a little. You stop caring at about the 2-minute mark because you're warm. Then there's the hot brick, and this one changed my winters. The auto campers heated a common brick or a flat stone by the fire or on the manifold, wrapped it in a towel, and put it at the foot of the bed. A dense brick holds heat for hours and gives it back slowly, right where your feet are, and warm feet are the whole game in cold sleeping. I heat a plain clay brick in my oven at 200 degrees for about 20 minutes, wrap it in an old towel, and it keeps the bottom of my bed warm most of the night for essentially nothing. Compare that to running a furnace or a space heater all night to warm air. You're not even breathing under the covers. And here's the reversal that surprised me most. The same crowd that knew how to trap heat in winter knew how to shed it in summer, and their cooling tricks are the ones we've most completely lost. So let me hand you those, because summer is where the modern power bill really bleeds you. The auto campers lived and died by shade and airflow, and they were precise about it. They knew that parking under a tree wasn't enough. The direction mattered. They wanted the vehicle shaded from the low, hot afternoon sun on the west side, because west sun in late day is what turns any enclosed space into an oven. The same rule runs your house. The extension services have measured this for decades. West-facing windows take on far more heat load in the afternoon than any other side of the home. If you shade your west windows, outside if you can, with anything from an awning to a leaning board to a simple exterior curtain, you cut the heat before it ever gets through the glass. Once the sun is through the glass and inside, blocking it is nearly useless. The old-timers knew you fight the sun outside the wall, not inside it. If what I'm describing here resonates with you, this sense that the most useful knowledge gets buried on purpose, I've gone much deeper on all of it in my book. I've collected the most actionable methods recovered from these old guides, the ones I've actually tested, across 3 editions. First Winds, which gets you started fast, Deeper Cuts, which goes further into the system, and the Full Stack, which is everything. You can find whichever level fits you best in the description below. But let's get back to the thread, because the trail gets even quieter before it gets good. Then there was the wet sheet trick, and this one is almost magic for how simple it is. On a dry, hot evening, they'd hang a damp sheet or canvas across the open side of the sleeping space where a breeze came through. As the breeze passed through the wet cloth, the water evaporated, and evaporation pulls heat out of the air. The air coming off that sheet could be 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the air going in. It's the exact same physics that makes you shiver when you step out of a pool. You can do this tonight in a bedroom. Hang a damp sheet in front of an open window or a fan, and in dry air the room cools noticeably within minutes for the cost of a little water. In humid air it works less well, and the old guides said as much, which is one more reason I trust them. They told you when their tricks failed. So heating and cooling, the 2 things we now pay the most for, were both solved a century ago by people with no money and no grid. That satisfied part of what I was chasing, but it still didn't explain the note in that margin. Cook it before you leave, eat it at noon. That wasn't about temperature. That was about food and about time, and it turned out to be the deepest secret of the whole movement. Because here's the problem every vehicle dweller faced, then and now. Cooking takes fuel, and fuel costs money and takes up space. And cooking while you travel is dangerous or impossible. So how did these people eat hot, cooked meals day after day without burning fuel all day long? I assume they just ate cold food and canned beans. Wrong again. The old guides described families sitting down to hot stew, cooked beans, tender pot roast, steamed pudding, at noon in the middle of nowhere, with no fire going and no fuel burned since dawn. That made no sense to me, until I found the device the whole thing hinged on. And this is where the trail got quiet, the way it always does right before it gets good. Because the thing they were using had been actively promoted by the United States government, then dropped, then nearly erased. So let me lay out the last clue before I hand you the answer. The margin note pointed at a method, not a gadget you buy. The 1920s camping guides kept referring to it almost casually, the way you'd mention a coffee pot, assuming everyone knew what it was. They called it fireless cookery. And the more references I chased, the more I realized this wasn't a camping trick at all. It had been a mainstream household technology a decade earlier, pushed into millions of American kitchens, and then it simply disappeared from the culture as if it had never existed. Something that useful doesn't vanish on its own. By now you know what that usually means. So here is where the trail ended, and here is the method, and I want you to hear how simple it is before you decide it can't be real. In 1908, a woman named Margaret Mitchell published a book called The Fireless Cookbook, and it became a sensation. Around the same time, the movement got the strongest endorsement possible. The United States Department of Agriculture put out farmers' bulletins on fireless cookery, teaching ordinary households how to build and use one, because it saved fuel, saved money, and saved the cook from standing over a hot stove all day in a farmhouse kitchen in summer. Home economics departments at land-grant universities tested it and taught it. During the First World War, it was promoted hard as a patriotic way to conserve fuel. For a stretch of years, the fireless cooker was as normal as a mixing bowl. Here is what it actually is. A fireless cooker, also called a haybox, is nothing but an insulated box that finishes cooking food with the heat already in it. You bring your pot of stew, beans, oatmeal, soup, rice, or a roast to a hard boil on the stove for a few minutes. Just a few. Then you take the whole pot, lid on tight, and nestle it into a box packed all around with insulation. Straw, hay, crumpled newspaper, wool, old towels, anything that traps air. You close the lid, and you walk away. The food is already hot. The insulation stops the heat from escaping, and the food keeps cooking itself for hours. Beans that would need 3 hours of gas on the stove finish in the box while you're driving down the road, or while you're at work, or out in the garden. That was the note. Cook it before you leave. Eat it at noon. The auto campers would bring a pot to a boil over the morning campfire, seal it in the fireless cooker, drive all morning, and open a fully cooked hot meal at lunch, having burned fuel for only the first few minutes. No fire while driving, no danger, no cost. A hot meal from stored heat. And it works. I built one to be sure, because I don't trust a method I haven't tested with my own hands. I used a plain cardboard box, a smaller box inside it, and I packed the gap with crumpled newspaper and an old wool sweater. I brought a pot of dried beans and water to a rolling boil for about 10 minutes, dropped the covered pot into the nest, folded a pillow on top, and closed it. 5 hours later, the beans were fully cooked, tender, still hot enough to steam, and I had run my stove for 10 minutes instead of 2 or 3 hours. I did it again with a chicken and rice dish. Same result. Hot, cooked, safe, done. Let me put real numbers on why this matters, because this is the part that turns a neat trick into something worth doing. Slow-cooked dishes, beans, tough cuts of meat, grains, porridge, stews are exactly the cheapest foods you can buy, and exactly the foods that normally demand the most cooking fuel. A fireless cooker cuts the active cooking time for those dishes by roughly 80 to 90%. You go from hours of burner or oven time down to a few minutes of hard boil. On a gas or electric bill, over a year of cooking beans and grains and stews the frugal way, that adds up to real money kept in your pocket. And you can build the cooker for nothing out of a box and materials you already own. Now think about why it disappeared. It cost almost nothing to make, and it ran on zero fuel after the first few minutes. There was no product to sell you, no cartridge, no refill, no upgrade, no monthly anything. You built it once from scrap and it worked forever. That is precisely the kind of method that has no defender in the marketplace. Nobody advertises it because nobody profits from it. As kitchens filled up with appliances that had to be bought, plugged in, and eventually replaced, the humble box that cost nothing and lasted forever got pushed to the back of the closet and then out of memory entirely. It didn't fail. It just didn't make anyone rich, so it was allowed to be forgotten. But it was never actually lost. That's the part of this that I find almost moving. The knowledge was kept alive, quietly, in the exact places you'd expect a stubborn old truth to survive. In those government bulletins sitting in library basements. In Margaret Mitchell's book, still findable if you know its name. among a scattering of homesteaders and old country families who never stopped using the haybox because their grandmothers swore by it. The tin can tourists carried it down the road with them and left it in the margins of guides that ended up in estate sale boxes, waiting for somebody to get curious enough to ask what the note meant. The chain never fully broke. It just went underground. And now it's in your hands. Here's how you make one this weekend so this doesn't stay a story. Find a box big enough to hold your cooking pot with room all around it. Find a second, larger box, or line the first with a thick layer of insulation. Pack the space around the pot with anything that traps air. Crumpled newspaper works fine. Wool or old towels work better. Leave a well in the middle size to your pot. Make a thick insulated cushion for the top. Then cook. Bring your beans, soup, stew, rice, or oatmeal to a full rolling boil on the stove for 5 to 10 minutes. Get it good and hot all the way through. Put the lid on tight. Set the whole pot into the nest. Pack the cushion on top and close it up. Do not open it to peek, because every peek lets the heat out. Give beans about 5 hours, grains and soups less, and let a roast go most of the day. Open it and eat. One honest safety note, because the old bulletins were honest about it, and so will I. Get the food to a genuine hard boil before you insulate it and eat it within the day. The method holds cooking heat, but if the food drifts down into the lukewarm range for too many hours, it's no longer safe. Same as any food left out. Hot and sealed and eaten by evening is the rule. Follow that, and you've got a cooker that would make a tin can tourist nod in approval. So there it is, the note in the margin, cracked open. A whole vanished way of living, from the wet sheet in the window, to the hot brick at your feet, to the box that cooks your dinner with stored heat, recovered from the people who worked it out under harder conditions than most of us will ever face. What I keep coming back to is this. None of these people were rich, and every one of them lived more freely and more cheaply than we're told is possible, and that freedom didn't fade because it stopped working. It was taken, one ordinance and one forgotten bulletin at a time, by people who understood there was money in making us forget. Recovering it feels less like learning a trick and more like taking something back that was ours all along. If you're the kind of person who's always suspected that the most useful know-how gets buried precisely because it's free, that the good stuff was quietly shelved to protect somebody's sale, then you already understand what this channel is really about. And you belong here. Now I want to hear from you, and I want a real answer, not just a scroll past. Would you actually build the fireless cooker out of a box and old newspaper and trust it with your dinner? Or does the idea of walking away from a pot still make you nervous? Tell me in the comments, honestly, because I read them and I want to know where you land. And if you built one, tell me what you cooked and how it came out. Subscribe and stand with the rest of us who are digging this knowledge back up before it's gone for good, because there's more, and the next trail I'm following is a strange one. It's about a way people kept milk and butter and meat fresh for days in the heat of summer, with no ice and no refrigerator, using nothing but a clay pot, some sand, and water, and the numbers I'm finding on how cold it actually got are hard to believe. I tested it. It works. I'll show you next time. I hope you enjoyed that, because honestly, we barely scratched the surface. Inside my membership, the Old Ways Society, I've put together the complete tin can tourist manual. It picks up right where this video left off. Ask me anything in there, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You won't be doing it alone. You belong with us. Just point your phone at the code on screen. Cancel anytime, one click, no risk.